Cops shoot at white Navy SEAL during traffic stop. But then he shoots back. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty streets as Alex drove through the quiet town. A former Navy SEAL, he had retired from military service in search of a quieter life, far away from the chaos and violence that had defined his days in uniform. The transition to civilian life had not been easy. Despite his best efforts to put the past behind him, the weight of the things he had seen and done still lingered. He had hoped that living in a small town, away from the bustle of the city, would bring him peace. But that evening, it felt as if everything was about to change. Alex had been driving home from running a few errands, nothing out of the ordinary. The radio played softly in the background as he maneuvered through the winding roads, his mind lost in thought. He glanced in the rearview mirror and noticed a patrol car with its lights flashing behind him. His heart skipped a beat, not out of fear but out of instinct. Even after all these years, the sight of flashing lights brought a rush of adrenaline. He eased his foot off the gas pedal, signaling to pull over to the side of the road. The officer's car came to a stop behind his, the engine humming as the officer slowly exited his vehicle. Alex's eyes quickly scanned the situation. The officer, a young man with a serious expression, approached his window. Alex didn't recognize him, but the tension in the air was palpable. "Good evening, sir," the officer said, his voice stern. "Can I see your license and registration?" Alex nodded, keeping his hands firmly on the steering wheel. The officer's demeanor was professional, but there was something off. His eyes darted around, scanning Alex's face and his surroundings as though he was on edge. Alex wasn't sure why, but something in the officer's posture made him feel uneasy. Perhaps it was the way the officer's hand rested on the holster of his sidearm, or the subtle tension in his voice. It wasn't just a routine stop. Alex slowly reached for his glove compartment, retrieving the registration and his license, handing them over with deliberate calmness. He made sure to keep his movements slow and clear, so there would be no misunderstanding. But the officer's gaze didn't leave him, as if searching for something. "You nervous, officer?" Alex asked with a slight smile, trying to ease the tension. The officer didn't respond to the question. Instead, he stared at the license for a long moment, and then something seemed to click in his mind. The officer's eyes narrowed and his posture stiffened. Alex felt a sudden, inexplicable shift in the air. It was a shift that wasn't there before. His military instincts kicked in. Something wasn't right. The officer took a step back, his hand now visibly resting on his gun. "Step out of the vehicle," he barked. Alex froze, confused. "What? I haven't done anything wrong. I've already given you everything you asked for. Step out of the vehicle, now." The officer's tone had become sharp, demanding. There was a brief silence. The seconds felt like hours. Alex could feel his heartbeat quicken, and his instincts flared into overdrive. His mind raced. He had trained for this moment. He had trained for combat, for situations where life and death hung in the balance. But this wasn't combat. It was a traffic stop. The world seemed to tilt slightly, like he was on the edge of a cliff staring into the unknown. "Why are you acting like this?" Alex asked, trying to stay calm. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm just trying to get home." But the officer didn't respond. Instead, he stepped back and reached for his radio. Alex's senses were on high alert now. He didn't know if this was some sort of misunderstanding or if there was something deeper going on. But what he did know was that the officer's demeanor had changed in a way that felt dangerous. The situation had shifted from a routine stop to something far more volatile. Before Alex could react further, there was a sudden movement. The officer's hand was now fully on his gun, and in that instant, Alex understood what was happening. He wasn't being treated like a civilian. He was being treated like a threat. The officer's finger twitched on the trigger and the world exploded into chaos. Shots rang out. Alex's heart slammed into his chest, the sound of gunfire reverberating in his ears. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. He dove to the side, his instincts taking over. Years of training flooded his mind in that split second. Drop. Move. Take cover. The officer fired again, the bullet whizzing past his head. Alex's hand shot out, instinctively grabbing the gun he kept in his holster. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want to shoot, but he had no choice. He wasn't going to die like this. Not in the middle of some random street. He fired back, the sound of his own gunfire deafening in the night air. But Alex wasn't aiming to kill. He wasn't trying to escalate the situation. He was just trying to survive. He didn't even know if he hit the officer. His mind was consumed with the need to stay alive. The adrenaline surged through his veins, sharpening his senses as he scanned the area looking for cover. In a matter of seconds, the scene had gone from a quiet evening drive to a life-or-death struggle. The officer fell back, seeking cover behind his patrol car, and Alex knew this wasn't over. He could hear the sound of more patrol cars pulling up in the distance. Sirens wailed, growing louder by the second. Alex took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. His hand was still gripping the gun, and his mind was still racing. His thoughts spun. This was supposed to be over. He was just trying to get home. But now he was part of a situation he never could have imagined. A simple traffic stop had spiraled into something much darker. The odds were against him. He could feel it. He had to act fast. He rose from his position, scanning the street for any movement. He could hear the shouts of other officers approaching. They were coming for him now. They saw him as a threat. He wasn't sure if they would see him as a man fighting for his life or as a dangerous criminal. His mind raced through the options: run, fight, or surrender. He was a trained warrior, but this was no battlefield. This was the real world. He had survived life and death situations before, but he had never felt so uncertain. The world felt like it was closing in on him, the weight of every decision pressing down on his shoulders. And then, as the sirens grew louder, the thought crossed his mind. He had survived this far. He had made it through the toughest battles. But now he was facing something far more uncertain. The real fight was about to begin. The world around Alex blurred into chaos, but his body moved like a well-oiled machine. Years of military training, the drills, the exercises, the split-second decisions that had kept him alive in far more dangerous places, kicked in. There was no hesitation, no time to wonder if he should or shouldn't act. The sirens were growing louder, the tension thicker, but his focus remained razor-sharp, his mind calm in the storm. It was fight or flight now, and Alex wasn't ready to flee. As soon as the shots had rung out, Alex's instincts told him one thing: survive. The officer who had fired at him had hidden behind his patrol car, seeking cover. His training told him not to panic, but the cold grip of adrenaline squeezed his chest. He couldn't let this situation escalate any further. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting against a perception, a misunderstanding. He was fighting a battle with himself, his mind, his memories, the kind of person he was now versus who he had been in uniform. He stayed low, his back pressed against the cold asphalt, the concrete beneath him rough against his skin. The noise of the world seemed to recede as his thoughts sharpened. He didn't want to hurt anyone. He didn't want another chapter of violence written in his life, but here he was, in a battle he hadn't chosen. The sound of boots hitting the pavement reached his ears. More officers. He could hear their commands, their shouts to each other as they set up a perimeter, but their words were indistinct. They didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't understand who Alex was, or more importantly, who he wasn't. He wasn't the criminal they might have assumed him to be. He was a man who had once fought for his country, a man who was just trying to live a peaceful life. But that didn't matter now. The situation was too far gone. The first instinct, the one that had saved him in countless firefights, was to remain still, breathe deeply, and keep his senses alert. His fingers tightened around his weapon, his mind calculating his next move. Should he fight? Should he run? Running, however, would only make him seem guilty, even though he wasn't. He couldn't show weakness. That's what his training had taught him. Alex's breath was steady now, and his thoughts were clear. As long as he didn't make the first aggressive move, he could survive this. He wasn't a threat. He had to prove that, and then a voice cut through the air like a knife. "Drop the weapon!" It was a command, loud and clear, from another officer. His voice was shaking, laced with fear and authority, the latter struggling to overcome the former. Alex could tell that the officer wasn't sure what to do. His training was telling him to issue commands, but his fear was telling him that there was something much bigger than a traffic stop unfolding here. "Drop it now," the officer yelled again. Alex's heart pounded in his chest, but his grip on the gun remained firm. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't the villain in this scene. But to these officers, he probably looked like one. And if there was one thing Alex had learned in his years of service, It was that the moment someone saw you as a threat, you could no longer afford to make mistakes. They would take the slightest hesitation as an opportunity to strike. The seconds seemed to stretch into infinity as Alex considered his next move. His hand still held the gun, but he wasn't aiming at anyone. He wasn't preparing to fire. He was simply holding on, trying to make sense of the situation, to understand how things had gone from 0 to 100 so quickly. The sound of more police officers arrived, their footsteps growing louder, closer. They were surrounding him, but they weren't yet in position to overpower him. This was his moment. His window of time to do something, anything, to de-escalate this. His military training, something he had spent years honing, told him he had options. He could stand, raise his hands, and show them that he wasn't going to shoot, but that move was risky. It might make him seem like he was giving up. But the alternative, remaining where he was, gun still in hand, was just as dangerous. The officers were already tense, already afraid. And fear was a powerful weapon. When people are scared, they don't think clearly. "Listen to me," Alex finally spoke, his voice calm, steady. He was trying to reach them, trying to connect on some level, but the words didn't sound as confident as they had in his head. They came out clipped, edged with urgency. "I don't want trouble. I'm just trying to survive here." The officers were silent for a moment, but it was clear that they didn't know how to respond. One of them shouted for him to drop the weapon again, but this time it was less authoritative and more like a plea. The desperation in his voice struck Alex like a physical blow. These were people just trying to do their job, and here he was, a man caught in the middle of a misunderstanding. It wasn't just about the gun anymore. It wasn't about survival in the traditional sense. It was about how far he was willing to go to prove he wasn't a threat. And if he couldn't convince them now, there would be no way to get out of this alive. A voice broke through the tension. This one calm, measured with years of experience behind it. "I've got him covered," the voice said, likely from one of the senior officers who had arrived on the scene. "Move in slow. Don't give him reason to panic." Alex's eyes snapped to the direction of the voice, his mind processing quickly. They were moving in, closing the distance. But he had an advantage, an internal calmness that only years of service could give him. His mind raced with possibilities. If he moved now, if he rose and showed them he wasn't a threat, they might hesitate. And hesitation could cost him everything. Then, just as the tension was at its peak, Alex made his decision. He slowly lowered the gun, his eyes never leaving the officers' positions. He needed to show them he wasn't a threat, but he couldn't do it quickly. He couldn't make a sudden move. He had to do it in such a way that they wouldn't panic and fire at him. He placed the gun on the ground, his fingers trembling, but the action was controlled. He moved his hands away, palm up, slowly, and for the first time since the shooting started, the world seemed to pause. There was a moment, a brief moment, where the gunfire stopped ringing in his ears and the world seemed to hold its breath. Alex stood there, not yet fully standing, his back still against the cold concrete. But his message was clear. He wasn't there to fight. He wasn't there to kill. He was just trying to stay alive. The sound of officers approaching grew louder, but it wasn't just the sound of heavy boots. There was something else now, something different. Something like a collective breath, as if the entire world had waited for this moment of calm. But Alex knew that peace was fleeting. He could already hear the officers speaking, coordinating, preparing for the next step. He had just bought himself a few seconds, but that wasn't enough to change what had happened. The situation was still precarious. The fight wasn't over, and Alex was still standing on the edge, unsure whether the next few moments would seal his fate or save him. The days that followed the traffic stop blurred together in a haze of flashing lights, shouting voices, and cold steel. Alex had been arrested, but the nightmare didn't end there. It was only the beginning. His hands were cuffed, his life suddenly reduced to a series of headlines and sound bites. The world outside no longer saw him as Alex, a former Navy SEAL, a man who had fought for his country and who simply wanted a quiet life. No, the world now saw him as something entirely different, something dangerous, something to be feared. The morning after the arrest, Alex was transferred to a holding facility. He had thought he would be in and out quickly, but the charge against him, a charge that seemed so absurd when he thought about it, was already snowballing into something much larger. There had been a misunderstanding, a miscommunication between him and the officer. Alex had never intended for things to spiral out of control, but they had, and now his face was plastered all over news outlets. The media wasted no time in making him a villain. The footage from the body cameras had been released, playing out like a brutal montage of confusion, missteps, and panic. The headline screamed, "Ex-Navy SEAL fires on police during routine traffic stop. Former military member turns deadly on police officers." It was a story of chaos, an act of aggression, a man who had seemingly snapped, unable to control his rage. Alex couldn't help but feel like he was drowning in the tidal wave of attention. There were times when he wanted to scream, to shout from the rooftops that they didn't understand, that they had it all wrong. But he knew that would only make things worse. The media had already painted its picture, and it was one they were not likely to erase quickly. He wasn't just a man now. He was an image, a symbol of everything the public feared. The press had taken the smallest fragment of truth and twisted it until it no longer resembled the reality of what had happened. The phone calls started coming in. His lawyer, his family, even some of his former SEAL brothers, all trying to navigate the chaos with him. His mother, the woman who had raised him to believe in the best of people, broke down on the phone. "I know you, Alex," she said, her voice quivering. "I know you didn't do this. You never would. But how do we make them see that?" He didn't have an answer. He couldn't even find the words to comfort her because deep down, he wasn't sure how to comfort himself. The image of that officer trembling with fear, the sound of his gunshots ringing in the night, it kept replaying in Alex's mind. He had defended himself. That was all. He had done what he had been trained to do. But to the world, it didn't matter. They didn't know him. They didn't know the man who had spent countless hours on foreign soil, facing threats with nothing but his wits and his training. They only saw what they had been told to see, and it wasn't just the media. The public opinion had splintered, and everyone seemed to have their own idea of who Alex was and why he did what he did. Some saw him as a hero, a man who had been wronged by a nervous officer who had overreacted. They rallied behind him, raising voices in support, organizing protests, holding signs that read, "Justice for Alex," and "Stop the injustice." But for every person who supported him, there were 10 others who condemned him. The anger from those who didn't understand his actions was palpable. They called him a threat to society, a danger lurking just beneath the surface of every former soldier. They couldn't see past his uniform, past the military training, past the years he had spent fighting in wars. To them, Alex was a weapon, a time bomb waiting to explode. They demanded accountability, pushing for him to be punished, to make an example of him. It was a backlash fueled by fear, fear of the unknown, fear of someone who had been trained to kill and who, for all they knew, could snap at any moment. And the worst part was, Alex understood where they were coming from. He had been there. He had been the one on the other side of the fence, the one looking at a soldier and wondering who they really were. He had seen the damage that war had done to his brothers in arms. He had seen the scars, the broken minds. Was he any different? Was this what happened when men like him tried to return to civilian life? But there was a deeper pain than just the judgment. The loneliness was eating him from the inside. He had always prided himself on being able to deal with isolation. He had spent long stretches alone, deep in enemy territory, where he had learned to trust only himself. But this was different. He wasn't alone in the desert anymore, fighting for survival. Now he was isolated in the eyes of the world, misunderstood, vilified, and trapped in the aftermath of something he couldn't undo. His lawyer, a sharp and no-nonsense woman named Sarah, told him that they had to keep his head down, avoid the media, and wait for the trial. There would be no quick resolution. It was going to be a long fight, longer than he could have imagined. But in the meantime, he was a prisoner in his own home. His every move was watched. People looked at him with suspicion when he went to the store, when he tried to walk his dog. And everywhere he went, the whispers followed him. Even the people who had supported him during his service seemed to question him now. There were those who had once looked up to him as a symbol of bravery and strength, but now they too were pulling back. A part of Alex understood why. People feared what they didn't understand, and in a world where fear ruled, the truth had a way of getting buried beneath the weight of public perception. At night, when the world was quiet, Alex would sit by the window, staring out at the streetlights flickering in the distance. He thought about his time in the Navy, The camaraderie, the purpose, the sense of being part of something bigger than himself. It had all felt so real, so right. But now, as he looked out at the street, it felt like everything he had worked for was slipping away, replaced by the shadows of doubt. He had been a warrior. He had been a protector, but now he was a symbol of violence, a casualty of a society that couldn't tell the difference between a man defending his life and a man out of control. His thoughts spiraled in confusion and frustration, but there was one thing he knew for sure. If he didn't stand up, if he didn't make them see the truth, then the world would never understand who he really was. And in that moment, as the weight of everything pressed down on him, Alex realized that his fight wasn't over. It had just begun. The world was looking at him. Everyone was waiting for him to break, to show some sign of weakness. But Alex wasn't going to give them that. He wasn't going to let the narrative be written for him. He would fight not with violence, but with his words, his actions, his truth. He would show them who he really was. Not the man they feared, but the man who had always just wanted to live a quiet life. And if that meant fighting for his future, for his name, then he would fight with everything he had left. But first he had to survive the storm. And the storm was far from over. Days stretched into weeks, and Alex felt every second dragging him further away from the life he had once known. The walls of his small apartment had begun to close in on him. The loneliness was suffocating, and the noise from the media outside never stopped. He could hear the faint murmur of news anchors' voices through the thin walls, each one offering their own take on the events that had unfolded that night. The shooting, the tension, the tragedy. They painted him as a figure of controversy, a man on the edge, a symbol of everything wrong with the justice system. And as much as he wanted to ignore it, he couldn't. It was there everywhere, a constant reminder that the world was watching him, judging him. The case against him seemed to snowball with every passing day. The police had their statements, the witnesses had their opinions, and the media had their narrative. It was a machine built to churn out a story, and it didn't care much for the truth. The more he thought about it, the more Alex realized how much of this was out of his control. They weren't interested in his side of the story. They were interested in the story that sold. And right now, his story wasn't selling peace or redemption. It was selling chaos, violence, and fear. Alex's lawyer, Sarah, had warned him that this would be a long and difficult battle. She wasn't wrong. From the moment the charges were filed, the stakes had been set impossibly high. The courtroom was now the battlefield. Every hearing felt like a war of words, a battle for his future, for his freedom. But despite the overwhelming evidence against him in the public eye, Alex's lawyer had one clear message: we have a chance. It wasn't a given, and it wasn't easy, but Sarah believed that the truth would eventually prevail. The problem was that the truth didn't fit neatly into the sound bites the world was consuming. His truth wasn't as clear-cut as the headlines suggested. He wasn't the villain the media had made him out to be. He hadn't shot the officer out of malice or rage. He had only acted in defense of his life, a life that now seemed more fragile than ever before. Every night, after the weight of the day's events wore off, Alex would sit alone, staring at the documents scattered across his table. The charges were laid out plainly in front of him: aggravated assault on a law enforcement officer, attempted murder, reckless endangerment. Words that stung with a finality he couldn't ignore. He hadn't wanted any of this. He hadn't wanted to become a symbol. All he had wanted was to be left alone, to live a life in peace. But here he was, his future hanging by a thread, each court appearance making that thread a little bit thinner. His mind would often wander back to that moment in the street, the officer drawing his weapon, the chaos of that instant. Alex's heart would race as he relived the confusion and the panic. He had acted out of instinct. There was no room for thought in that moment. The world had erupted around him, and his only focus had been survival. But now, as he sat there thinking it over again and again, he realized how little of it made sense. How could he explain that? How could he convince them that he was not the man they had created in their minds? The longer the legal process dragged on, the more Alex found himself questioning the fairness of it all. He had done everything right, hadn't he? He had followed protocol. He had acted out of necessity. He had done what he was trained to do. Yet, as the courtroom date loomed closer, Alex felt something deeper, something far more unnerving settling in his chest. Fear. Fear not of the legal consequences, Not of the public's judgment, but of what would happen if the truth was drowned out. What if they couldn't see past the noise? What if they couldn't understand the man he truly was? That fear lingered even as Sarah continued to prepare his defense, working tirelessly, analyzing every angle, every detail. There were depositions to be taken, testimonies to be gathered. The court of public opinion had already made its decision, but in the courtroom he still had a chance. That was the only place where Alex felt like he had some semblance of control, where the facts could be presented without the distortion of the media. But as the days passed, the pressure mounted. He wasn't just fighting the system anymore. He was fighting the perceptions that had taken root in people's minds. His friends from the Navy, those who had once called him brother, seemed distant now. They watched from afar, unsure of how to react to the unfolding spectacle. Some sent messages of encouragement, some stayed silent, but none of them truly understood what it felt like to be in his shoes. They didn't understand the weight of living through a nightmare of your own making. How do you explain to someone that you didn't choose this path, that you were only doing what you thought was right? As the case dragged on, Alex began to doubt himself more and more. The fear he had pushed aside for so long, fear of being alone, fear of being misunderstood, began to creep back in, gnawing at him, tugging at his thoughts. And every time he thought he had made peace with the situation, something would happen that pulled him back into the fray. A new headline, a new accusation, a new opinion about who he was. It was hard to escape the noise, the constant hum of judgment. The voices of those who saw him as a criminal echoed in his mind, louder than the ones who still believed in him. And in the midst of all that, the question lingered. What if they never believe me? Despite the overwhelming obstacles, Sarah's voice remained a steadying force. She reminded him that the truth couldn't be buried forever, that the facts would eventually speak for themselves. But it was hard to remain hopeful when the weight of public opinion was so overwhelming. The public didn't care about facts. They cared about the story, the narrative that had already been written, the version that was easier to digest. To them, Alex was a broken man, a former soldier who had crossed a line whose training had turned him into a weapon. The weeks felt endless, like a string of bad dreams that refused to end. But then something unexpected happened. The media began to shift. Slowly at first, but it was enough to catch Alex's attention. More reports started emerging about the context of the incident, the confusion at the scene, the officer's heightened fear, the possibility that the officer had overreacted. Journalists who had initially painted Alex as a monster began to ask harder questions, questions that hadn't been asked before. Was this truly a case of self-defense? Or was there something else at play? Alex tried not to get his hopes up. He knew the public's memory was short and any shift in narrative could be fleeting. But the fact that the story was evolving was a small victory. It was a glimmer of light in the darkness, a sign that maybe, just maybe, the truth had a chance to break through. But even as the tide seemed to turn, Alex's fight was far from over. The legal battle still loomed, and each day was filled with new challenges. But for the first time in weeks, Alex found a spark of hope. Maybe the truth had a chance to survive after all. Maybe there was still a way out of this mess, but it would take everything he had, and just as he had done in his military days, he would have to dig deep, find that strength within himself and keep pushing forward, no matter the cost. The quiet of his apartment was suffocating. It wasn't the kind of silence that spoke of peace or rest. It was the silence of being trapped, the kind of silence that made every thought feel louder, every emotion sharper. Alex sat by the window, his back against the cool glass, staring out at the city lights that flickered below. They seemed so far away, almost unreachable, and he couldn't help but think how much his world had shrunk since the night everything changed. A former Navy SEAL, once accustomed to the chaos of battlefields, to the noise of gunfire and the weight of responsibility, now found himself battling something far less tangible. The walls of his own mind, the trial was coming. The final confrontation between the truth and the distortion of the story, being told by everyone else, and yet in the quiet moments when he was left to his thoughts, the questions he couldn't escape circled relentlessly. Was he a good man? Was he a soldier who had fought for the right reasons? Or was he now a monster in the eyes of the world? Could he ever make them understand what had truly happened on that street, under those flashing lights when his life had been on the line? Alex closed his eyes, trying to shut out the relentless noise inside his head. He didn't want to think about the trial, about the headlines, about the scrutiny. He didn't want to think about how the whole world seemed to see him as a threat now. He wanted to go back, to forget, to find some semblance of peace again. But peace seemed like a faraway dream. Instead, he was left with nothing but fragments of the past, the things he had done, the choices he had made, the man he had been in the Navy, the mission he had fought for, the blood he had spilled, and in the stillness of the night, those fragments began to shift and collide with each other, like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit together. He wasn't sure anymore where the soldier ended and where Alex the man began. He thought back to his time in the service, the days spent on foreign soil, in hostile environments, fighting for survival. He had been trained to face fear, to look death in the eye and move forward regardless of the cost. Every mission had been a test of endurance, of willpower. He had known that what he was doing was dangerous, but he had also believed in the cause. He had believed that his sacrifices meant something, that they were part of something larger than himself. That belief had been the foundation of everything he did. But here he was now, far from the front lines, facing an entirely different battle. A battle that wasn't about right or wrong, good or bad, it was about perception. And perception, Alex was learning, could be more dangerous than any enemy he had ever faced. The memories came flooding back, unbidden. The faces of the men he had fought beside. The sound of gunfire in the night. The way they had learned to depend on each other, to trust each other, when the rest of the world seemed to be spinning out of control. Those days had been brutal, but they had also been purposeful. They had given him a sense of clarity he hadn't known before. He had been part of something bigger, something that mattered, and now looking at his life from the outside, it felt like that purpose had been lost, swallowed up by the shadows of misunderstanding and fear. Alex rubbed his face with his hands, feeling the weight of the exhaustion that had been building for weeks. The legal battle, the constant scrutiny, the way the world had turned on him, it was too much. He had once believed that the truth was enough, that it could be seen for what it was, but the truth was slipping through his fingers like sand. In the end, all that mattered was the story people were willing to believe. He turned away from the window and glanced at the photo on his desk, the one of his squad. They were all smiles caught in a rare moment of peace, their faces frozen in time. He remembered that day well. They had been taking a break, resting after a mission that had left them all bloodied and bruised. They were soldiers, and in that moment they were brothers. Alex had known then that they would face anything together. But now, sitting alone in the dark, that bond seemed so distant. Some of them had reached out after the incident, messages of support, offers to help. But others had stayed quiet, unsure of what to say, unsure of what had really happened. There was a growing sense of disconnection that Alex couldn't ignore. The bonds he had forged in the military had felt so solid, so unbreakable, but now even those bonds were being tested. His former comrades, those who had seen him at his strongest, were now uncertain of who he was. Could they still trust him? Could they still call him their brother? But it wasn't just his friends who had turned away. It was the world. It was the system. The justice system had its own way of operating, its own logic that didn't always make sense. And right now, Alex was caught in the middle of it. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he understood the system he had fought so hard to protect. What had happened to him, to his life, seemed so unjust, so disconnected from the principles he had fought for. But was he really the victim here? Could he still stand by the things he had done in his past without regret? Or had they led him to this moment of darkness? The court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict. Some called him a hero, a man wronged by an overzealous officer. Others saw him as a criminal, a danger to society. He couldn't change their minds. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how he had begun to doubt himself. He couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, he had become what everyone feared. It wasn't just the shooting that haunted him, it was everything that had led up to it. The way he had reacted, the way he had moved through life. Was he too quick to pull the trigger? Was he too hardened by the violence he had seen, the wars he had fought, to even consider another path? He had spent years living in a world where everything was black and white, where the choices were clear, where the mission was always the priority. But now he was trapped in a world full of shades of gray. The lines between right and wrong had blurred, and Alex wasn't sure where he stood anymore. The truth, the reality of the situation, was that he couldn't change what had happened. but he could still change what he did next. He could still try to make things right. Alex took a deep breath and stood up, stretching his arms above his head. The weight in his chest hadn't lifted, but the resolve inside him had shifted. He wasn't going to let this moment define him. He wasn't going to let the story that everyone else told about him become his truth. He was more than that. He was more than the man they saw on TV, the man who had been caught in a web of confusion and fear. He had to be. The trial would come. The world would have its say. But Alex would stand tall. He would not let the shadows of his past or the fears of those around him consume him. He would keep fighting for his truth, for the person he knew he was. It wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about finding redemption, about reconciling the man he had been with the man he wanted to be. As he looked at the photo again, at the faces of his brothers in arms, Alex realized that they weren't the ones who would judge him now. They weren't the ones who would decide who he truly was. He was the only one who could do that. And for the first time in a long while, that thought gave him a sense of peace. He wasn't alone, not completely. His past, his training, his brothers, they had shaped him, but they didn't define him. And whatever came next, he would face it on his own terms. The weight of the past had always seemed heavy, but now, in this quiet moment, it felt like an anchor, dragging Alex deeper into the waters of uncertainty. He stood at the window again, staring out at the world moving on without him. People walked down the street, their lives unaffected by the storm he was weathering. Cars sped by, people laughed and talked. Everything was moving forward except for him. He had been stuck in this limbo, this strange space between his old life and the new one that had been forced upon him, but there was no escaping it anymore. The trial was nearing. The media had already branded him, and it wasn't just his reputation at stake now. It was his future. The worst part, Alex realized, wasn't the legal battle or the media's constant vilification of him. It wasn't even the anger from some members of the public who couldn't understand his side of the story. No, it was the realization that he had lost himself in all of it. Somewhere between the military and the chaos of the traffic stop, he had forgotten who he was. He had forgotten what it meant to stand tall without the weight of judgment crushing him. And now, as he faced the final stretch before the trial, he had one choice left: to keep fighting, not just for his freedom, but for his own sense of self. It wasn't about winning the case or proving the world wrong. It was about making amends for the man he had become, or rather the man he had allowed himself to become. The soldier who had once been so sure of his purpose, so certain of his role in the world, was now a shadow of that person. But there was still time to fix it. Alex knew that making amends wasn't about apologizing for the past, it was about rebuilding what had been lost, piece by piece. He had to start with himself. The first step was reaching out to the officer involved in the shooting. Alex had no idea if the man would ever be willing to hear him out, but it was something he had to try. He had never been one to shy away from difficult conversations, and this one, as painful as it was long overdue. He couldn't undo what had happened, but maybe he could offer the officer some clarity. Maybe he could explain face to face that he had never meant to hurt anyone, that he was just a man trying to survive in a situation he hadn't created. Alex spent days thinking about what he would say. There were no guarantees. The officer might never accept his apology, might never even listen. But he had to try. He couldn't move on with his life, couldn't clear his conscience without at least attempting to make things right. When he finally sent the letter, he had no expectations. He knew that the officer might refuse, might even press charges, but something inside him pushed him forward. This wasn't just for the officer, it was for him. It was for the man he had once been and the man he wanted to be again. Days passed, and Alex tried not to check the mailbox every hour. He tried to stay focused on the things he could control. But there was a part of him that couldn't help but hope for a response. He needed to know that he wasn't just another soldier who had fallen through the cracks. He needed to know that there was a way back, a way to make things right. And then one morning a letter came. It was from the officer. Alex opened the envelope slowly, his hands trembling. Inside was a short message. "I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that night, but I respect your courage in reaching out. I don't know if we'll ever be able to talk in person, but I appreciate your honesty. Take care." It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't an answer, but it was something. It was a step forward. The officer didn't forgive him, not yet, But there was a crack in the wall of misunderstanding, and that was enough for Alex to hold on to. The next step was more personal, something that had been eating away at him for years. The relationships with his old military brothers. When he had left the Navy, he had hoped for a smooth transition. He had hoped to walk away from the blood and violence to build a new life where he could be more than just a soldier, but that dream had been shattered, and now he found himself reaching out to the very people who had once been closest to him. They had all seen the headlines. They had all heard the rumors, and most of them, despite the bonds they had shared, had pulled away. He had been hesitant at first. He didn't know how to explain himself to them. But the truth was, he wasn't just fighting for his own redemption, he was fighting for theirs too. He had seen what the military had done to his brothers, the psychological scars, the trauma, the years of pain they had all endured. In the end, he wasn't just trying to save himself. He was trying to save them from the same trap he had fallen into, the trap of becoming a prisoner of his past, of letting his identity be defined by the uniform he wore instead of the man he truly was. Alex sent messages. One by one, he reached out to the men he had fought alongside. He didn't expect them all to respond, but he had to try. He had to show them that he wasn't the same person who had walked away all those years ago, that he had learned, that he had changed, and that he was still one of them despite everything. It wasn't easy. Some of them didn't reply. Some of them never would, but a few did. And in their responses, Alex found something he hadn't expected: understanding. There was pain in their words, but there was also hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could all find a way back to who they had been before the war, before the trauma. As the trial loomed closer, Alex knew that the road ahead was still uncertain. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. He had made amends not just with others, but with himself. He had taken responsibility for the things he had done, for the choices he had made, and in doing so, he had begun to reclaim his life. It wasn't about clearing his name. It wasn't about the media or the public's opinion. It was about finding peace, real peace, peace that came from within, from knowing that he had done everything he could to make things right. And as he stood there, looking out the window once more, Alex realized something he hadn't understood before. Redemption wasn't something you earned. It was something you found piece by making the right choices, by choosing to be better. And no matter what happened next, he knew that he had already started that journey. The courtroom was eerily quiet, the air thick with tension, every gaze focused on Alex as he sat in the defendant's chair. The weight of the world seemed to rest on his shoulders, and yet, in this moment, there was a strange sense of calm within him. It wasn't the confidence of a man expecting to win or a man seeking absolution. It was something more. It was the quiet peace that comes from knowing, deep down, that no matter what happened here today, he had already changed. The room was full: lawyers, reporters, spectators, the judge, and of course the jury. But Alex couldn't focus on them. He couldn't focus on the press or the world outside, because they weren't the ones who would decide his fate. He had come to understand something crucial in the past few months. The court of public opinion, the judgment of strangers, none of it mattered in the way he had once believed. What mattered was his own conviction, his understanding of the events, his ability to live with himself when the dust finally settled. And whatever verdict came today, he knew he had already taken responsibility for his actions in a way that went beyond any legal decision. The trial had been a spectacle. Of course it had. It was a story of a man who had served his country, a man who had been trained to kill, who had somehow been thrust into a deadly situation and acted in a way the world would never truly understand. It was a tragedy, yes. It was a chaotic misunderstanding. But it had become more than that. It had become the embodiment of fears that people had long held about soldiers, about the military, about what happens when a man who has seen war is let loose into the civilian world. The press had fed on the story, dissecting every move, every word. The narrative had been twisted, turned inside out until it no longer resembled the truth. But none of that mattered now. It had all led him here, sitting in this room, facing the final step in his journey. A journey he hadn't asked for, but one that had changed him in ways he was only just beginning to comprehend. The trial had dragged on for weeks, with testimony after testimony, each one revealing a little more of the night that had forever altered his life. The officer involved had spoken, and though his words were difficult to listen to, Alex understood. He understood the fear in that officer's eyes, the same fear that had triggered the chaos in the first place. Fear had been the enemy that night, and fear had shaped everything that happened after. It wasn't just the officer who was afraid, it was Alex too. But the difference was Alex had known how to fight through fear. He had been trained to do it. He had reacted in the only way he knew how. And yet in doing so, he had become a villain in a story that wasn't fully his to tell. The prosecution had done its job, building a case against him, painting him as a man who had crossed a line, a man who had taken things too far. They had emphasized the severity of the incident, the danger of returning fire at a police officer. And while Alex understood their argument, he also understood something else. He had never been the aggressor. He had never sought to escalate the situation. His actions had been a reaction to an environment that had spiraled out of control. The truth of the matter was that he had acted out of instinct, not malice. But how do you explain instinct to a jury? How do you convey the terror of a split-second decision when every voice around you is telling you that you're wrong, that you're dangerous? And yet Alex was not afraid anymore. The fear that had once dominated him, that had consumed his thoughts in the dark of night, was gone. It had taken months of reflection, of conversations with old friends, of deep, painful introspection. But here he was, standing on the edge of something he hadn't thought possible. Peace. The defense had made their case, but the words that resonated the most in Alex's mind were those of his lawyer, Sarah. She had reminded him over and over that this wasn't about convincing the jury. It was about standing firm in his truth. The truth doesn't need to be defended, she had said. It just needs to be told. And sometimes that's all you can do. The jury had deliberated for what seemed like an eternity. The voices in the room had been muted, as if the world itself had held its breath, waiting for the final decision. Alex had been pacing, unable to sit still. The quiet buzz of conversation between his legal team had barely registered in his mind. He wasn't focused on the outcome anymore. He had made his peace. The rest was out of his hands. Then the doors to the courtroom opened and the judge entered, followed by the jury. The silence in the room was deafening as everyone took their places, all eyes on the foreman. Alex sat up straighter, his heart pounding in his chest, but there was no longer fear there. There was only a deep, steady resolve. The foreman stood up and addressed the court. We, the jury, find the defendant, Alex Walker, not guilty of the charges brought against him.